People like you wait in line. The words cut through the late morning air like a gavel striking wood, sharp, final, meant to be heard by everyone standing on the wide stone steps outside the courthouse. Officer Daniel Hayes didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. Authority lived in the way he stood, feet planted, shoulders squared, one hand resting near his belt as if the badge on his chest did all the speaking for him. The crowd shifted, a low murmur passing through a line of well-dressed attorneys, reporters, and onlookers gathered beneath the tall marble columns. At the center of it stood Evelyn Carter, 72 years old, barely 5'4", her coat a soft gray worn thin at the cuffs, her gloved hands wrapped carefully around a small, weathered box pressed against her chest. She didn't step back. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, reflective, catching the pale winter sunlight that spilled across the courthouse steps. A gust of wind moved through the plaza, lifting the edges of her scarf, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the faint echo of a siren somewhere blocks away. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose, already turning his attention back to the barricade separating the general public from the restricted entrance, the one reserved for officials, witnesses, and those who belonged. To him, it was routine. Another face out of place. Another moment of control restored before it could become a problem. But Evelyn didn't move. The line behind her hesitated, unsure whether to step around or stay still, their polished shoes scraping lightly against concrete as uncertainty settled in. A young reporter lowered her camera just slightly, sensing something unspoken lingering in the air. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the box, her fingers tightening just enough to crease the edge of the cardboard lid. The box itself was old, its corners softened with time, a faint strip of tape running along one side where it had once been repaired. Whatever was inside, she held it like it mattered more than anything else in that moment. "I'm not here for the line," she said quietly, her voice calm, almost gentle, but it carried just far. Enough to reach him. Daniel paused, just for a fraction of a second, the smallest interruption in his rhythm. He turned his head back toward her, his brow tightening, not in anger, but in mild irritation, the kind reserved for people who didn't follow instructions the first time. Around them, the courthouse stood silent and imposing, its tall windows reflecting the sky, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps, decisions, and stories that never made headlines. The sunlight shifted again, catching the metal of Daniel's badge, sending a brief flicker of brightness across his chest before fading just as quickly. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. She stood there, small against the scale of everything around her, yet somehow unmoved by it. The air felt heavier now, as if something unseen had settled between them, waiting. Daniel took a step closer, his boots firm against the ground, closing the distance with practiced ease. "Ma'am," he said, his tone measured, controlled. "You need to step aside." But even as he spoke, something about the stillness in her posture, the quiet certainty in her eyes, lingered just a moment longer than it should have, like a question he hadn't meant to ask, but suddenly couldn't ignore. Daniel Hayes had dealt with hesitation before, with people who paused, argued, or tried to explain their way past a line that was never meant to be crossed. But this felt different, quieter, like standing in a room where something important had already happened and he had just walked in too late to understand it. Evelyn Carter did not raise her voice, did not shift her feet, did not even glance at the people beginning to gather behind her. The courthouse clock above the columns ticked forward, each second echoing faintly against the stone, blending with the distant hum of the city waking into midday. A man in a navy suit checked his watch, then looked from Evelyn to Daniel, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. A woman near the barricade adjusted her coat, her eyes fixed on the small box in Evelyn's hands as if it held an answer she could not name. Daniel straightened slightly, the fabric of his uniform pulling taut across his shoulders, the weight of his radio pressing against his side. He had been on this post since early morning, filtering movement, reading intent in glances, in posture, in the way people approached authority. It had always been simple. Order depended on clarity. You either belonged or you did not. You either followed instructions or you stepped aside. That was how the day moved forward without chaos. "Ma'am," he repeated, slower this time, each word measured. "This entrance is restricted." The sunlight shifted again, softer now, stretching shadows across the steps, tracing the lines in Evelyn's face. The quiet strength settled there like something earned over time, not given. She lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if weighing something far more important than the moment in front of her. Her thumb brushed lightly across the edge of the box, feeling the worn surface, the slight ridge where the cardboard had been reinforced years ago. It was a small motion, almost invisible, but deliberate, grounding. "I understand," she said, her voice even, carrying no urgency, no fear, only certainty. A faint breeze passed between them, lifting a loose strand of her gray hair, carrying with it the scent of cold stone and distant exhaust. Daniel watched her for a second longer than necessary, something in her tone not matching the situation he believed he controlled. Behind him, a radio crackled briefly, a voice calling out a code he recognized but did not respond to. His attention stayed on her. The line behind Evelyn began to shift again, people stepping cautiously to the side, creating space around her as if they sensed the moment expanding beyond something ordinary. A young intern clutched a folder tighter against his chest, his knuckles pale, eyes moving between the officer and the woman as though trying to understand who held the real authority. Evelyn lifted her gaze again, meeting Daniel's eyes directly, not challenging, not pleading, simply present. "I am here for something that cannot wait," she said softly. The words settled into the air, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Daniel felt a brief flicker of irritation, not because of what she said, but because of how it landed, calm where it should have been defensive, steady where it should have yielded. He shifted his stance, the heel of his boot scraping lightly against the stone, grounding himself in the familiar rhythm of control. "Everyone here has a reason," he replied, his tone firmer now, drawing a line he expected to hold. But even as he spoke, the space between them felt altered, as if the rules he relied on were being tested in a way he could not immediately define. Evelyn did not argue. She did not step forward. She simply held the box closer, the edges pressing into her coat, her posture unchanged, her presence quietly resisting the expectation placed upon her. And for the first time that morning, Daniel hesitated, not in action, but in certainty, a small fracture in the clarity he had carried onto those steps, barely visible, but real. Daniel Hayes had been trained to read a scene within seconds, to identify who posed a risk, who needed direction, and who could be ignored, but Evelyn Carter did not fit into any category that made his job easier. She was not disruptive, not loud, not defiant in any obvious way, yet she stood there as if the space itself had adjusted around her presence. The courthouse doors behind him opened briefly, a rush of cooler air slipping through the gap as two officials exited in hurried conversation, their polished shoes tapping sharply against the stone before fading into the background. Daniel glanced toward them out of habit, then back at Evelyn, his focus narrowing again. His jaw tightened slightly, not from anger, but from the quiet pressure of being watched. He could feel it now, the attention gathering, subtle but real, cameras lifting just a few inches higher, conversations lowering into whispers. He shifted his weight, the leather of his belt creaking softly, grounding himself in routine. "Ma'am, I am asking you one last time," he said, his tone firm but controlled, each word chosen to re-establish the boundary he believed had been crossed. "Please step to the public line." The words hung between them, clear, official, final. Evelyn did not move. Instead, she adjusted her stance just slightly, her feet settling more evenly on the stone as if preparing to stand longer rather than leave. The small box in her hands tilted a fraction, revealing the faint edge of something inside, a corner of yellowed paper tucked beneath the lid. She noticed the shift immediately and steadied it, her fingers pressing gently along the sides, protective, careful. Her eyes lifted again, meeting his with the same quiet clarity, unchanged. "I have waited long enough," she said, her voice soft, but it carried with a weight that did not match its volume. Daniel felt the words land differently this time, not as resistance, but as something deeper, something rooted in time he could not see. Behind Evelyn, a man in a gray overcoat stepped out of line, choosing to wait off to the side rather than pass her, his expression uncertain, respectful in a way he did not fully understand. A woman holding a notepad paused mid-sentence, her pen hovering just above the page as if the moment in front of her demanded to be recorded but not interrupted. The courthouse clock continued its steady rhythm above them, each tick marking seconds that now felt longer than they should. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible for just a moment in the cool air before disappearing. He reached toward the small radio clipped to his shoulder, his fingers brushing against it without pressing the button, a reflex he had developed over years of maintaining control without escalation. He did not call for backup. Not yet. Something about the stillness held him there, suspended between action and restraint. "Whatever business you have inside," he said, his voice lower now, more measured. "There are procedures. Everyone follows them." Evelyn's gaze softened just slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, as if she understood the system he was defending and the limits it placed on both of them. "Procedures are meant to protect truth," she replied quietly, "not delay it." The words settled into the space between them, heavier than before, drawing a deeper silence from the crowd. Daniel's eyes flickered briefly toward the box again, then back to her face, searching for something he could define, something that would return the moment to something familiar. But nothing about her shifted. She stood there, composed, patient, holding something that mattered in a way he could not yet see. And for the first time since stepping onto those courthouse steps that morning, Daniel felt the edges of certainty begin to blur, not enough to change his stance, but enough to make him question, just for a moment, whether the line he was guarding had already been crossed long before she arrived. Daniel's fingers finally settled against the radio clipped to his shoulder, pressing the button just long enough to break the silence with a brief burst of static before his voice cut in, low and controlled, requesting a supervisor to the front steps without urgency, but with intent. The response came back almost immediately, a confirmation that someone was already on their way. He released the button and let his hand fall back to his side, the small act shifting something in the air as the people nearby exchanged quick glances, sensing that the moment had crossed into something more official. Evelyn Carter remained still, her posture unchanged, the box steady in her hands as if time itself had slowed around her. The faint sound of heels approaching echoed from behind the courthouse doors, measured and deliberate, growing clearer with each step. Daniel straightened again, aligning himself with the expectation of oversight, of procedure being observed and confirmed. He did not look away from Evelyn, but his awareness widened, tracking movement, anticipating the arrival that would restore order to a situation that no longer felt entirely his to control. A tall woman in a dark coat emerged from the entrance, her badge clipped neatly at her waist, her presence calm but authoritative in a way that did not need to announce itself. Lieutenant Rebecca Collins paused just inside the threshold, her eyes moving quickly across the scene, taking in the spacing of the crowd, the tension in posture, the quiet center formed by Evelyn and Daniel. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the stone, each step precise, unhurried. "Officer Hayes," she said, her tone even, acknowledging him first before shifting her gaze to Evelyn. There was no immediate judgment in her expression, only observation, the kind that measured more than what was visible. Daniel nodded once, his voice steady as he explained, "Ma'am is attempting to access a restricted entrance without proper clearance." The words sounded correct, structured, but they felt thinner now than they had moments before. Collins listened without interruption, then turned fully toward Evelyn, her attention settling there with quiet focus. For a brief second, something flickered across her face, subtle but unmistakable, recognition not yet spoken. Evelyn met her gaze with the same calm she had held from the beginning, neither defensive nor demanding, simply present. The wind shifted again, softer this time, carrying a faint rustle of paper from somewhere near the steps. The box in Evelyn's hands tilted just slightly as she adjusted her grip, the lid loosening enough for the contents inside to shift. A single photograph slipped forward, its edge catching the light before sliding halfway out. Collins's eyes dropped to it instinctively. The image was aged, its colors muted by time, but the figures within it were clear enough, a group standing in front of a building that looked strikingly familiar. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for Daniel to notice. He followed her gaze, his attention drawn to the photograph, to the detail he had not seen before. Collins stepped closer, her voice quieter now, directed not at Daniel, but at Evelyn. "May I?" she asked gently, gesturing toward the box. Evelyn hesitated only a fraction of a second before giving a small nod. Collins reached out carefully, her fingers brushing the edge of the photograph as she lifted it just enough to see it fully. The silence around them deepened, the crowd holding its breath without realizing it. Daniel watched, something tightening in his chest, not fear, not yet, but a growing awareness that the situation was shifting beyond his initial judgment. Collins studied the image for a moment longer, then looked back at Evelyn, her voice lower, almost respectful now. "You should have said something sooner." Evelyn's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "I tried," she replied softly. And in that quiet exchange, something invisible but undeniable moved through the space between all of them, a shift that Daniel could feel even before he understood it, like the first crack in something he had believed was solid. Daniel felt the shift before he could name it, like the ground beneath a steady stance turning unfamiliar without warning. And he watched as Lieutenant Collins held the photograph just a second longer than necessary, her thumb brushing lightly across its worn edge, as if confirming something she already knew but did not expect to find here. The courthouse steps, once filled with quiet routine, now carried a different kind of silence, one that pressed in from all sides as more eyes fixed on the small space between the three of them. Collins lowered the photograph slowly, her posture no longer neutral, her attention anchored fully on Evelyn Carter with a weight that had not been there before. "This image," she said carefully, her voice low but clear enough to carry, "was taken right here, on these steps, nearly 40 years ago." A murmur rippled faintly through the crowd, subtle but present, as if memory itself had been stirred without warning. Daniel's gaze moved between the photograph and Evelyn, his mind working to reconcile the ordinary figure he had stopped moments ago with the implication forming in front of him. Evelyn did not react to the statement, not outwardly, her expression steady, her grip on the box unchanged, but there was something in the way she stood, a quiet endurance, that now felt heavier, more deliberate. Collins turned slightly, angling the photograph just enough for Daniel to see it more clearly. The image showed a group of uniformed officers standing in formation, the courthouse steps behind them, the same columns, the same worn stone, but younger, untouched by the years that had passed. At the center of the group stood a woman, composed, direct, her posture unmistakably firm even in the faded print. Daniel's breath caught, not dramatically, but enough to interrupt the rhythm he had maintained all morning. The resemblance was not immediate, not obvious to someone who was not looking for it, but once seen, it could not be dismissed. Collins spoke again, quieter now, but with a certainty that settled over the moment. She was one of the first to stand there when others said she could not. The words carried history without needing explanation, and the weight of them pressed into the space between authority and assumption. Daniel felt the edges of his earlier certainty begin to collapse inward, not loudly, but steadily, as if each second revealed something he had failed to see. The radio at his shoulder crackled again, a distant voice asking for confirmation, but he did not respond. His attention stayed fixed on Evelyn, on the photograph, on the connection forming too clearly to ignore. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened once more, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his expression shifting the moment he noticed Collins and the photograph in her hand. He approached quickly, not hurried, but with purpose, his gaze moving from Collins to Evelyn with recognition that was immediate and unmistakable. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying both surprise and respect. The name landed differently now, no longer just an identification, but an acknowledgement. The crowd reacted in small, quiet ways, heads turning, posture straightening, the atmosphere tightening with realization. Daniel stood still, the weight of his badge suddenly more present against his chest, not as authority, but as something being measured. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the man without shifting her stance. She did not step forward. She did not demand anything. She simply remained where she had been from the beginning, holding the box, holding her place. Collins returned the photograph carefully, sliding it back into the box with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding them. "We should get you inside," she said softly. Evelyn's eyes moved briefly to Daniel, not accusatory, not confrontational, but steady, present, as if allowing him to see the moment fully before it passed. And in that look, quiet and unspoken, Daniel felt something deeper than embarrassment begin to take hold, something closer to recognition, the kind that does not disappear once it arrives. The air did not move the same way anymore, as if the entire courthouse had taken a breath and decided to hold it. And Daniel Hayes stood in the center of it, aware of every small detail he had ignored just minutes ago, the faint crease in Evelyn Carter's gloves, the way the sunlight rested on the edge of the box she held, the quiet steadiness in her posture that no longer looked like hesitation, but something closer to resolve built over years he could not measure. Lieutenant Collins stepped slightly to the side, creating a clear path toward the courthouse doors, her gesture subtle but unmistakable, and the man in the dark suit waited near the entrance, his attention fixed on Evelyn with a patience that carried respect rather than urgency. The crowd no longer murmured. Phones lowered. Eyes remained. The moment had shifted from curiosity to recognition, and it settled heavily across the stone steps. Evelyn did not move immediately. Instead, she looked down at the box in her hands, her fingers tracing along its worn edge once more, grounding herself in something private before the world stepped back in. The courthouse clock ticked again, louder now in the quiet, marking time that felt slower than it should. Daniel became aware of his own breathing, steady but heavier, each inhale carrying the weight of everything he had assumed, everything he had said without question. He had enforced lines all his career, drawn them clean and sharp, believing they held order, believing they were necessary. But standing here, watching the path open for someone he had tried to turn away, those lines no longer felt as solid as they had an hour ago. Evelyn lifted her gaze again, and for a brief moment, her eyes met his once more, not with judgment, not with anger, but with something far more disarming, a quiet acknowledgement that said she had seen this before, not him specifically, but the moment, the misunderstanding, the barrier placed without thought. She shifted her weight slightly, preparing to step forward, and the movement felt significant in a way that had nothing to do with distance. Her shoes made a soft sound against the stone as she took one step, then another, moving toward the entrance that had been denied to her minutes earlier. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint rustle of her coat and the distant hum of the city beyond the steps. As she passed Daniel, the space between them narrowed just enough for him to notice the faint scent of paper and time, something carried in the box she held, something that belonged to a story larger than this moment. He did not stop her. He did not reach out. His hands remained at his sides, still, uncertain, as if any movement now would only confirm what had already become clear. Collins fell into step just behind Evelyn, not leading, not directing, but accompanying, her presence now protective rather than procedural. The man in the suit opened the courthouse door wider, stepping aside with a nod that carried weight without words. Evelyn paused just at the threshold, not long, just a second, enough to look up at the building that had stood here long before this day, long before this moment, her expression unreadable but full. Then she stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her, the sound echoing faintly against the marble and stone, leaving Daniel standing where he had been from the beginning, but no longer the same. The space felt larger now, emptier, as if something important had passed through it and taken the air with it. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for the first time, not to the ground, but to the space where she had stood, where the line he believed in had quietly dissolved without force, without argument, leaving only the weight of understanding behind. Inside the courthouse, the air felt cooler, quieter, as if the noise from the steps had been sealed outside the moment the doors closed, and Evelyn Carter walked forward with measured steps across the polished marble floor, her reflection faint beneath her feet, steady and unbroken. The high ceiling carried a soft echo of movement, distant footsteps, the quiet shuffle of papers, the low murmur of voices that paused just slightly as she passed. Lieutenant Collins remained a step behind, not guiding, not directing, simply present, her earlier authority now transformed into something more observant, almost protective. The man in the dark suit moved ahead to open a second set of doors, his posture straight, his expression composed, But there was a carefulness in his movements, a recognition that this moment carried weight beyond routine proceedings. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the box once more, her fingers brushing the edge where the cardboard had softened over decades, the texture familiar, grounding, like something that had traveled with her through years that no one here had witnessed. As she entered the inner hallway, a series of framed photographs lined the walls, images of past ceremonies, officials, and milestones preserved in quiet permanence. Her eyes moved across them without stopping, but something in her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if each frame held a fragment of a history she knew far more intimately than the polished presentation suggested. Collins noticed it, her gaze following Evelyn's for a brief second before returning forward, her silence deliberate. At the far end of the hallway, a small group of individuals waited near a courtroom entrance, their posture formal, their attention immediately drawn as Evelyn approached. One older man stepped forward, his hair silver, his suit pressed with precision, his eyes widening with recognition that did not need to be spoken aloud. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, his voice carrying a depth of respect that settled into the space like something long overdue. Evelyn stopped in front of him, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. There was no surprise in her expression, only a calm acceptance, as if she had anticipated this moment not with expectation, but with readiness. The man glanced briefly at the box in her hands, then back to her face, his voice softening further. "We were not sure you would come." Evelyn's lips moved just slightly, her response measured and simple. "Some things deserve to be finished." The words carried a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forceful, but absolute in their meaning. Collins shifted her stance slightly, allowing the exchange to remain uninterrupted, her role now clearly secondary to something larger unfolding. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened again, letting in a faint trace of outside air before closing, sealing the moment once more. The group near the courtroom parted just enough to create space, their movements respectful, deliberate, acknowledging Evelyn not as a visitor, but as someone returning to a place that had once been hers in a way few could understand. As she stepped forward, the box remained steady in her hands, its contents unseen but clearly significant, something that had carried history through time, waiting for this exact moment to be revealed. And as she crossed the threshold toward the courtroom, the weight of what she carried was no longer just her own. It was shared now, felt in the quiet stillness of those around her, in the way the air itself seemed to hold on to every second, knowing that something long buried was about to come into the light. Evelyn Carter stepped into the courtroom, and the quiet shifted into something deeper, more intentional, as if every person inside understood without being told that this was not just another proceeding on the docket, not just another name to be called and dismissed, but something that had waited years to arrive. The wooden benches were already filled, the soft rustle of fabric and paper settling into stillness as she moved forward, her footsteps measured, steady, echoing lightly across the polished floor. The judge's bench stood elevated at the far end, framed by the American flag and the state seal, both unmoving, watching over a room that now felt suspended between past and present. Evelyn did not rush. She did not hesitate. She walked with the same calm certainty she had carried from the steps outside, the box still held close, as if it contained not just objects, but memory itself. The older man who had greeted her earlier took his place to the side, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture respectful, almost deferential. Lieutenant Collins remained near the back, her presence quiet now, her role complete, yet her attention unwavering. As Evelyn reached the center of the room, she paused, not out of uncertainty, but intention, allowing the silence to settle fully before she moved again. The judge, a woman with composed features and steady eyes, leaned forward slightly, her expression softening as recognition touched her gaze. "Ms. Carter," she said, her voice clear, carrying across the room with measured authority, "we have been waiting for you." The words did not sound procedural. They sounded personal. Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without dramatics, without hesitation. She stepped closer to the table positioned before the bench and gently placed the box down, the soft sound of cardboard against wood echoing faintly in the stillness. For a moment, She rested her hands on top of it, her fingers spreading slightly, feeling the surface one last time before letting go. Then, slowly, she opened it. The lid lifted with care, revealing the contents within: aged documents, photographs, and a small metal badge, its surface dulled by time but unmistakable in form. A quiet intake of breath moved through the room, subtle but shared, as the pieces of history were laid bare. Evelyn reached in and lifted the badge first, holding it carefully between her fingers, the metal catching the light just enough to reflect a faint glow across the polished wood. She did not raise her voice when she spoke. She did not need to. "This was given to me," she said, her tone steady, grounded, "on a day when I was told I would never stand here." The room remained silent, every word settling with weight. She placed the badge gently on the table, then unfolded one of the documents, the paper thin, edges worn, but preserved with care. "And this," she continued, "was taken away before I was given the chance to finish what I started." The judge's expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in understanding, as if the story was not unfamiliar, only incomplete until now. Evelyn looked up, her gaze steady, meeting the eyes before her without hesitation. "I am not here to reopen the past," she said quietly. "I am here to close it the right way." The words did not demand anything. They declared something. And in that moment, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of judgment, alone, but a place where something long denied was finally being seen, not through argument, not through force, but through truth that had waited long enough to be heard. The courtroom remained still long after Evelyn Carter's final words settled into the air, as if no one wanted to disturb what had just been placed in front of them, not just the badge or the documents, but the weight of something that had been carried quietly for decades and was now finally set down. The judge leaned back slightly, her hands folding together on the bench, her gaze fixed on the items resting on the table, then lifting slowly back to Evelyn with a depth of understanding that needed no explanation. There was no immediate ruling, no sharp declaration, only a pause that felt intentional, respectful, allowing the truth to exist fully before being processed. Evelyn did not speak again. She did not push, did not repeat herself. She simply stood there, her hands now resting at her sides, her shoulders relaxed in a way they had not been when she first arrived, as if something inside her had shifted from holding to releasing. The older man to the side lowered his head slightly, his expression softened, the lines in his face carrying a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost and what was now being restored. In the gallery, a few people adjusted their posture, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, as if they understood they were witnessing something that extended beyond the walls of the room. Lieutenant Collins remained near the back, her arms loosely at her sides, her earlier authority replaced by something more reflective, her gaze steady, following Evelyn not as a subject of procedure, but as someone whose story had altered the space itself. After a long moment, the judge spoke again, her voice calm, deliberate. "The court recognizes the submission." The words were simple, but they carried weight, not as an end, but as a beginning of correction, a quiet acknowledgement that something once dismissed was now being formally seen. Evelyn inclined her head once more, not in triumph, not in relief, but in completion. She reached forward, not to reclaim everything, but to gently close the box again, placing the documents and the badge back inside with the same care she had shown when opening it, as if their purpose had been fulfilled simply by being revealed. The lid settled into place with a soft, final sound. She lifted the box again, holding it close, but now it seemed lighter, not in weight, but in burden. Without waiting for further instruction, without drawing attention, she turned and began to walk back toward the aisle, her steps steady, unhurried, her presence unchanged yet somehow freer. The room parted quietly as she moved, people shifting just enough to create space, their eyes following her not with curiosity, but with respect that had not been there before. She reached the doors and paused only briefly, her hand resting on the handle as she looked forward, not back. Then she stepped through. Outside, the light had changed slightly, softer now, the afternoon settling in. The courthouse steps stretched out before her, familiar yet different, as if they held a memory that had finally been completed. At the base of the steps, Daniel Hayes still stood where he had been, his posture no longer rigid, his hands resting quietly at his sides. He looked up as she emerged, his expression no longer guarded, no longer certain, but open in a way that carried the weight of what he had learned without needing to speak it. For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them held no tension now, only understanding. Evelyn gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as forgiveness, not as judgment, but as acknowledgement, and then she continued down the steps, her pace steady, her figure moving into the flow of the city beyond. Daniel watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance, and as he stood there beneath the quiet sky, the badge on his chest caught the light once more, but this time it did not shine the same way. It reflected something deeper, something heavier, something that would remain long after the moment had passed.